welcome back. We are talking to Dr. Teresa Deischer. She is a molecular and cellular physiologist. That alone is quite
It's a mouthful.
yeah, it's very tongue twisting. So we were talking about stem cells earlier. I just want to underline one thing that you said, that uh, you can't put stem cells in an ordinary uh, jar of cream and put it on a counter in a department store or in an ordinary beauty, a spa clinic maybe.
Well, you could, but the stem cells wouldn't stay alive, and so then there'd be no benefit really from putting the stem cells in there. So when people are selling tablets or capsules that they claim are stem cells, I'm very skeptical that they're stem cells. As a matter of fact, I mean, it's very unlikely to contain any stem cell material. So I would think people would want to be very careful, you know, how you spend your money and yeah.
There's another thing that I'd like to ask you about, and you talked about this, about vaccinations. For the longest time, I think if my history serves me right, in the 1700s was when they first discovered smallpox vaccine or something. And, well, anyway, it helped in eradicating smallpox all over the world. Millions got saved. And then they came up with other vaccinations that people regularly go to, like for measles, for mumps, and typhoid. But what are these vaccines that you're talking about that you say maybe or are really dangerous to our health, rather than are there to help prevent any disease from, taking over our bodies?
Right. So, you know, vaccines are really just a virus. And what we're doing is we're making a virus in various forms and injecting it into our children or our bodies so that the virus can elicit an immune response and trigger a memory so that if we're ever exposed to the virus in the wild, we won't get sick, okay? So that's essentially what a vaccine is. And in order to make the viruses to put in the vial of the vaccine, we have to use cells to grow the virus because the virus is too big for us to make in a test tube economically. It would be too expensive. So we mimic nature's way of replicating viruses, and we infect cells in a laboratory. For many, many years, those viruses were grown in animal cells, in chick eggs, in quail eggs, right, in various animal cell lines. And what happened, and it's different for every country of the world because these vaccines are approved in different years, but it really started first in the United States. And in 1979, they started manufacturing some of the vaccines no longer in animal cells, but in cells that were taken from aborted babies. So aborted fetal cell lines, they're called human diploid cell lines. That's another name for an aborted fetal cell line. And there's a long list of cell lines that are used for various vaccines and other drugs that are made.
And what does this do? Okay, so first there's that aborted fetus, right? That means, again, it's a baby that did not quite make it as a child being born into this world, but somewhere along the line it got aborted. Did it get aborted because it didn't have a chance to live, or was it elected to be aborted?
So the babies that are used to make these cell lines are not spontaneous abortions or miscarriages. They are elective abortions where the parents choose to terminate the pregnancy. And the babies are pre-screened to be used for pharmaceutical purposes before they're aborted. So the parent's medical history is screened. The child is tested. The scientists don't want anything wrong with the baby. So they're really looking for perfect babies whose parents just don't want to have them and who choose to abort them.
And these are used as like the culture or
These are used as the source of the tissue to make these cell lines. And it sounds a bit mercenary, and it is a bit mercenary. It's almost sort of cannibalization in a way, to be commoditizing and commercializing the remains of the aborted babies. So a little backwards, really, if you think about it, to be doing those things, because we had hoped to have eliminated cannibalism from the world decades ago, right? And here we are using this in our medicines. Yeah.
And this is like they some of them are some of the babies actually made or they become babies because the parents were chosen to have these babies, and they have perfect characteristics for whatever diseases you'd like to treat. Some of these babies are made that way, perhaps.
I don't know about that. You hear rumors, and I really can't comment on that. What I can comment on is just the things that I know and that are well proven, and that is the derivation, the selection of these babies, because the scientists who did this have testified in front of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, as well as published what they did. So we know exactly what they did in that case. And I've heard rumors of other things, but can't speak about something that I don't understand.
Babies, so. Like, do they look like babies? Are they just at the beginning of gestation, maybe like 100 cells or 150 cells? Or are they actually formed as babies when they're aborted and used for these purposes?
The babies that were used to generate the cell lines ranged between 14 and about 18 to 20 weeks of age. And yes, they absolutely look like a baby. What's the distinction? So the embryo, right, is just a cellular stage, and the fetus is from 8 weeks of gestation on. Both of them are human beings, and there's a penchant to want to debate at what point does a human being get their soul. And if they don't have a soul, they're not human, and therefore it's okay to sacrifice them to use their materials for medical purposes. We can debate that all that we want, and we will not know the answer until we meet our Maker. Okay. In that case, it is always better to err on the side of conservative caution, so that we don't make a mistake and take the life of another human being because we convince ourselves it doesn't have a soul. I think you can think about this and ask, when did Jesus get his soul? Did God wait until he was 8 weeks of gestation to give him a soul? 6 months? I don't think so. I mean, we hear that John the Baptist leapt in his mother's womb when Mary approached with Jesus, and she had just shortly conceived. So I would err on the side of caution and just say a human being gets their soul at the moment of conception. And therefore, it is wrong to even sacrifice an early stage embryo that is a ball of cells, right? It's hard to be as passionate about that embryo as it is about a baby that you can see, and yet intellectually, it's a human being. It's the same thing.
Exactly. I was reading something about what you had said, that it's difficult to get excited about a clump of cells, you said. But I can see in you that you are truly passionate about these clumps of cells that don't necessarily look like a baby with arms and legs and all that. And so even if, let's say, they do harvest whatever material it is that comes from a bunch of cells that will eventually become a full-grown baby, it's just the same as ending the life of a bigger baby or fetus, which is about 5 months or 6 months old, right?
It is. It's ending a human life. And it might not be associated with pain, but it is the taking of a human life. And there really can't be any distinction. So, it's interesting. When I first became involved in this topic, in this debate, embryonic stem cells versus adult stem cells, my objection to the embryonic stem cells had nothing to do with morals. And as a matter of fact, at that point in my life, I wasn't a practicing Catholic, and I really wouldn't have cared morally one way or the other about whether a clump of cells was destroyed. My objections were that the embryonic stem cells form tumors. They would elicit an immune response if you gave them to someone, sort of a graft versus host disease attack. And they're outrageously expensive. They're not a good idea for a patient. The best thing to treat a patient with whenever possible is always their own cells. It's a no-brainer.
Right. No rejection?
No rejection, safe, no tumors, affordable. So these were my objections to embryonic stem cell research. But because the rationality in the US was sort of thrown in the garbage can about this, these issues, one is really forced to face these ethical and moral topics. And it was the unscientific and illogical pursuit of these embryonic stem cells that started me back on the road to faith, because in comparison to scientists who want to, against any logic or reason, do embryonic stem cell research, faith didn't start to look so illogical after all. It actually started to look pretty scientific compared to what the scientists were doing who wanted to go down that road.
Right. So what you're saying is there's no dichotomy between faith and science.
No.
That they do work together.
Absolutely.
Can't do one without the other.
Right. And, if you're a believer, I guess you would say God actually knew what he was doing.
Right.
And if you're a non-believer, then one
No
would have
amount
to
of
say
explanation's gonna
nature knows best.
Right.
Right? And nature, or God, has given us adult stem cells to use without violating or exploiting any other human being.
Okay. I want to know more about the ill effects of vaccines that have been cultivated or that are produced using materials from aborted
The aborted
fetuses.
fetal cell lines.
Right.
So as I said, we have to make the viruses in cells. And what happens during the manufacturing process is that some of the material from the aborted fetal cells winds up in the vaccine vial. And in the vial are fragments of the DNA or the genes of the aborted fetus. And in some of the vaccines, that aborted fetus was contaminated with a retrovirus. So there's a retrovirus contaminating the final product. Okay. So whenever we inject our children with these vaccines, we are also injecting them with contaminants from the aborted fetal cells used to make the vaccines. That is philosophically disgusting if you think about it. Injecting our children with aborted
contaminants?
fetal contaminants,
Right.
that yuck, so there's moral objections, there are philosophical objections, and then there's well-established biological reasons why that's not a good idea.
Okay.
Because when we use animal cells, we have those contaminants in our vaccines, but they're not human. And so we have an immune response to them and we get rid of them.
It's automatic. It's built in.
It's not dangerous.
right.
When we use the human cell lines, those are human. And they can do two things that are well established scientifically. It could cause an autoimmune or a self-attack, which is very possible. Or that material could insert into the genes of the child and cause mutations in disease.
Okay, we're going to talk about the diseases. I heard that you've done some studies, actual studies, on what these vaccines have caused. Instead of doing more good, it might have been the reason for some other illnesses, which we're going to talk about in just a while when we get back to our special program. We'll be right back.